Hello there! Welcome to Skeleton Key Productions. I'm Chronograce Kokon. Let's get into the video. Today's video we're going to be asking the question of what if America had a king? Now, as we discussed in the last video, this idea is not as ridiculous as it sounds, just giving you a heads up, okay? So when the founding fathers were sitting around and debating what sort of government the United States would have, one of the proposals made by Alexander Hamilton, who you know from not only the musical but also the back of the $10 bill, he was the one who came up with the suggestion that the president should serve for life, right? So he almost acting like a king, not exactly like a hereditary one, but you elect a president and then he serves for life. So that's the premise that this video is going to look down, right? So we're going to basically go through the timeline and we're going to look for each president and see what year they died in, and then just assume that, okay, cool, that's when the next one passed on. So imagine if you had one president, right, and he happens to die many years after his term's finished. Whatever president is in office in that year that he died, that's the next president in this timeline. So that's what we're going to go through. So, of course, the first president is George Washington. Now, George Washington in our timeline, he was the president from 1789 up until 1797. And he set a lot of the precedents for future presidents. So it's quite difficult to say precedent for future presidents. But anyway, so one of the things that he did is that he left after 2 terms, right? So after just 8 years. Now, he could have stayed on for a lot longer. And there was no constitutional amendment up until the 22nd, which actually restricted how many times a president could serve for, right? So it's something to bear in mind that, he could have, if he wanted to, stay on for as long as he wanted. But instead, he decided to leave after 2 terms, so just after 8 years. However, George Washington died in 1799. So in this timeline, we're going to assume that he is the president, not for 8 years, but for 10 years. The next president is John Adams, right? So again, nothing out of the ordinary because John Adams ended up being the next president anyway. So, so far so good. However, John Adams doesn't die until 1826. 1826. So that means that John Adams would have been the president for 27 years. Actually, as a matter of fact, for a bit of trivia, himself and Thomas Jefferson were big rivals, and they actually both died on the 4th of July in the same year of 1826. So that's just a little bit of trivia. But imagining, George Washington, 10 years, John Adams, 27 years, right? And also as well, both men happen to be in the same party. So this is already starting to get quite weird. The next president would have been John Quincy Adams. Yes, so the son of John Adams. So John Quincy Adams ended up becoming the president at a later point, but he wasn't like the third president, right? He didn't take over straight after his father. So he kind of followed the Bush Senior, Bush Junior kind of model of, you at least leave a little bit of a gap. But in this timeline, it would have gone straight from, like I said, George Washington, John Adams, John Quincy Adams. This is now starting to feel a little bit like a hereditary monarchy. And what would have made it worse is that John Quincy Adams would have been in the White House for 22 years. So you would have had, 49 years, quite early on within the state of the Republic, of the same family running the country. So I'm already going to say that this timeline wouldn't have happened, and that under any kind of common sense, this whole system would have fallen apart quite early on in the 19th century. But let's just continue with this anyway, right? So they already have done the caveat of this would never have happened. So now we can just move forward and have a bit of fun with it. So with John Quincy Adams dying in 1848, the next person would have been James Polk. Now, James Polk is quite an underrated president. However, he was quite pivotal. If you look on the US map, you can see just how influential his presidency was in terms of the expansion of the country. So taking lots of land from the Mexicans and also some of the other land out west as well. And so without his presidency and his kind of aggressive expansionist policy, it's debatable as to whether the United States would have expanded in the same way it did. Probably it wouldn't have done the same as it did in our timeline. It probably would have happened at a later point that states like Texas and California, etc., end up becoming part of the Union. But that's just something to kind of bear in mind, because James Polk ended up dying in 1949. So within our normal timeline, he served for 4 years. However, in this timeline, he would have only served for 1 year. Then the next person who would have taken over would have been Zachary Taylor. So Zachary Taylor was a war hero from the recent Mexican-American War, which James Polk led. And the only significant thing about him was, well, two things. One, he was a war veteran. Two, he had no values. And actually, I'll put in a third one. The third one is that he died just after a year in office. So yes, you can already start to see how this timeline would have started breaking down, because you'd had George Washington, okay, cool, then John Adams, then John Quincy Adams, his son, and then two presidents who would have died very quickly after each other after serving just 1 year. So already this system sounds a bit far-fetched and stuff, but again, we'll continue with it just for argument's sake. So who was the president in 1850? The very famous Millard Fillmore. Now, I had to actually check up on this guy because I'd never heard of him before. But get used to hearing about him, because he would have been in office from 1850 until 1874. So he would have been president for 24 years over the period which we now think of as the Civil War. But, based on like what his politics was actually like, there probably wouldn't have been a civil war, because he was very much, in favour of a compromise, right? He was very instrumental in the Compromise of 1850. So this is the kind of so-called Missouri Compromise, which said that states below the 36th parallel could have slavery if they wanted to, but that states above the 36th parallel could not have slavery. So he was instrumental in that. He was basically a moderate on the issue of slavery. And he later ended up running in the so-called Know Nothing Party. So this is the Native American Party. So not that kind of Native American. This was a nativist party. So this was anti-immigrant, anti-Irish, anti-Catholic, and pretty much just very xenophobic and stuff. And so if he'd been president all this time, America today would be unrecognizable, because if there's no civil war, then all the ramifications from that end up coming over. So as we discussed in the last video of what if the South had won the Civil War, you could imagine two kind of parallel countries kind of operating alongside each other. So you would have the free North and you would have the slave South. If anything, like, slavery would have expanded in this timeline, because the North at no point would have tried to rein it in. And without the election of a President Lincoln to restrict the expansion of slavery, then there would have been no Civil War in the first place. It would have been the continuation of the peculiar institution, as it was said. So far, the list is not that great. We had a good guy to start with, George Washington. The rest of them are kind of mediocre / horrible, right? So now we're going to finally get onto a president who's somewhat decent, Ulysses S Grant. And he would have been the president from 1874 up until 1885. So he was very instrumental within the kind of Reconstruction era. However, obviously, if there's no civil war, there's nothing for him to really reconstruct. And also, he kind of rose to prominence because of his role within the Civil War and being very instrumental in the Union's war strategy. So would Ulysses S Grant even have risen to prominence? Probably not. It's very difficult to kind of say what his presidency lasting this kind of 11 years would have really entailed, because, without there being a civil war, it's kind of unrecognisable. The next president after Ulysses S Grant would have been Grover Cleveland, and he would have been the president for 23 years, from 1885 until 1908. Now this is the era that we commonly refer to as being the Gilded Age. So this is the era in which 19th century capitalism kind of run amok here, with monopolies and just the expansion of the gap between rich and poor, far more than what we see in the current age now. So inequality between the richest people and the poorest people was just astronomical, right? And he would have been presiding over this, and he was himself very pro-business. So I don't really see much in the way of things changing this time. He was the only president who was elected and then ended up losing and then ended up getting re-elected again. And also as well, he was the only Democratic president after the Civil War, all the way up until Woodrow Wilson. The next president on this list would have been Teddy Roosevelt, right? So finally, a president that we all kind of know about, and he's famous. Well, he's on Mount Rushmore anyway, so he's pretty famous. So Teddy Roosevelt, he would have been the president from 1908 until 1919. And over these 11 years, he would have cracked down on the excesses of big business. He really tried to break up the different monopolies and the oil barons and the railway barons, etc., etc. And that's because he was a progressive Republican. So the parties in those days were kind of the opposite of what we see them as now. So he would have tried to push through a lot of progressive policies through the Congress. And also World War I, he wanted America to get involved in World War I, from 1914. Like, he really, really wanted them to jump in on the side of Britain. And yeah, so he was like itching for like America to get into the war. And so if he was the president during World War One, you can bet your bottom dollar that when it came to the sinking of the Lusitania, he would have jumped on that, right? So in 1915, German U-boats sank Lusitania, which was a civilian like cruiser ship. And yeah, he would have jumped at that and been like, right, we need to go to war with Germany. So America jumping in World War One 2 years before they actually did in our own timeline, that would have had really astronomical effect on the outcome of that war because it would have sped up the entire war by a significant margin, right? We could already see in our own timeline what happened when American troops came into that war. It was the straw that broke the camel's back here in terms of the German war effort. And so having an American force 2 years earlier with more time to prepare, more time to build up like arms and men, etc., I think that the war would have been over quite quickly. I don't know how decisively, but probably by 1917, the war would have been over. The next president that they would have had would have been Woodrow. The next president they would have had would have been Woodrow. Yeah, I'm there. The next president that they would have had would have been Woodrow Wilson, and that took me 3 times to say his name without like getting it jumbled up for some reason. But anyway, he would have been the president from 1919 up until 1924. So if in our own timeline, he was the president from 1912 to 1920. However, you know, he ended up like dying in 1924, and so that's where we're kind of going with this timeline. So we think of Wilson as being like the president who was around during World War One, and obviously the Treaty of Versailles, etc. And so while Wilson would have had a part to play in some of the like kind of negotiations and stuff during it, it wouldn't have been him who had kind of spearheaded the thing. Because if you think about it, the 14 points, which were kind of laid out by America saying this is our war aims, this is the terms in which like we want like Germany and like the rest of Europe to kind of like come to, yeah, that wouldn't have happened in this timeline. So Wilson's like liberal internationalism, this would have been what he would have still pushed for, but he would have come a little bit too late, yeah, like to have actually had a real impact in this timeline. So him dying in 1924, after the war, like at the tail end of the peace negotiations in Versailles, yeah, his presidency wouldn't have been that significant. The next president would have been Calvin Coolidge. So Calvin Coolidge, we're in our own timeline, he was the president from 1923 up until 1929. That's because the previous president, President Harding, ended up dying midway through his office, and so Calvin Coolidge ended up taking over from him. You know, and Calvin Coolidge was a very free market orientated president. He slashed the federal government, he slashed the top rate of tax. You know, he's kind of a libertarian conservative's kind of like wet dream basically. So he was very, very kind of like radical in that regard, and like reversed many of the progressive policies which had been implemented beforehand. And depending on where you sit on the political aisle, he was either a hero or he was the person who basically set up the conditions that led to the Great Depression. Now, talking about the Great Depression, this is where our video gets really, really interesting. So Calvin Coolidge died on January the 5th, 1933. However, the new president, in those days in particular, didn't come in until March. So now obviously it's January the 20th, but back in those days it was March the 4th. Now within our own timeline, you know, you had President Hoover, and he was from 1929 until 1933. However, the following president, FDR, he obviously won the election in 1932, but in this timeline there would have been no election in 1932. And so him coming to office wouldn't have happened because Calvin Coolidge dying on January the 5th of March would have been during the presidency of Herbert Hoover. And so Herbert Hoover, who was quite a young and healthy man, he would have been president from 1933 up until 1964. So the longest reigning president, or I don't know whether you say reigning because he's not a king, but whatever. The president who would have been in office the longest would have been Herbert Hoover, you know, who's, as we see now, is very, very unpopular. So you would have basically had, you know, a Republican president in Calvin Coolidge, and then continuation of a Republican president under Herbert Hoover, and many people blame Herbert Hoover and his actions for causing the Great Depression. So yeah, I'm not sure exactly how this would have gone down in this timeline. More likely than not, I think that if there was an election at the time of like him dying and stuff, probably like FDR would have ended up winning that. But yeah, for argument's sake, let's just say that Herbert Hoover is the president from 1933 to 64. So this encompasses, a lot of the era of the Great Depression. This encompasses World War II, much of the start of the Cold War, and all the way into the Civil Rights era. So yeah, this would have been quite unrecognizable. Like modern America, these are the years where like it went from being a minor power to being a superpower. So yeah, I don't know exactly how things would have gone down if he had been president, or how people would have taken this guy being like in office for 31 years. Now, president number 13 would be LBJ, Lyndon B Johnson. Now, in our own timeline, he ended up becoming the president after JFK was assassinated. However, in this timeline, we're going to imagine that he would have been elected off of his own back. Now, there's two things in particular to note about LBJ. One is that he was pushing for a great society at home. So this was, a lot of welfare spending, especially in the most deprived communities within America. And so we can imagine this in the stark contrast to Herbert Hoover, who, obviously there would have been no New Deal during this time. And it's not to say that he wouldn't have done some social protection, etc. Because although Herbert Hoover took over after Calvin Coolidge, the two men were very, very different, had completely different view on like conservatism and on like the size and scope of the federal government. So it's not to say that Herbert Hoover wouldn't have done anything, but nothing in comparison to what FDR wanted, and then nothing in comparison to what LBJ would later try and push through. So the Great Society in this time would have been a really sharp change from what it had been previously. Then also the other thing to note about LBJ is that he's the president that's most known for the Vietnam War. And actually in 1968, as a result of the Tet Offensive, he stood down his post as president and said that he would not accept his party's nomination for the 1968 general election. However, in this timeline, we're going to imagine that he doesn't hand in his notice, right? And that he's the president from 1964 up until his death in 1973. So this would have basically encompassed pretty much the entire war in Vietnam. So he would be known within the 9 years that he was president as the Great Society person at home and the Vietnam War president abroad. So yeah, that would have taken up quite a lot of his time and like kind of mental capacity. So he would certainly be known as one of the most influential US presidents. However, because the Vietnam War was seen as a failure, for a lot of people, LBJ has always been remembered as, the person who was responsible for them losing that war. So it's kind of a bittersweet kind of thing in a way for many people, because, he would have had a lot of like social programs for the poor, and obviously he did a lot of like civil rights things, but then also he was known as like the war president. And a lot of people, especially like Martin Luther King, said that something along the lines of the dream of the Great Society end up being, spilt on the fields of Vietnam. I'll get the quote up in a second. But yeah, so that's how he would have been known. So then the next president would have been Richard Nixon. So Richard Nixon, in our own timeline, ended up stepping down in 1974 as a result of the Watergate scandal. During the 1972 presidential election, he was spying on his opponents. Within this kind of alternative history, we're going to assume that presidents can't get removed from office once they are there, and they can't quit. Like once you've got it, you've literally got it for life, whether you want to or not. And so, you know what, actually, to make it interesting, let's assume that Watergate did happen. So Watergate happens, and yet he still ends up staying on as president. Well, Richard Nixon didn't end up dying until 1994. So he would have been president from 1973 until 1994. So if this Watergate scandal had happened in like the 73 election in this imaginary timeline, he would have been the president for over 20 years with this kind of thing hanging over his head of, you're the dude who like stole that election, basically. Yeah, I think the 1970s and 1980s were already a very turbulent time in America, but I think it would have been even more so. I think this mindset of like decline would have been even more exacerbated, because they would have been like, look at this corrupt president, he's we can't even get rid of him, he's just staying on and on and on. And yeah, and also as well, obviously the Reagan Revolution would never happened in the 1980s, so all the kind of like supply side economics, the kind of slashing taxes and trying to reduce spending, that wouldn't have happened, because Richard Nixon, as we said in previous videos, was very much the man who said, we're all Keynesians now. So he was very much in favour of like the kind of traditional economics that had been about during that time. So I don't think that much would have like really changed. I think that he would have continued a lot of the kind of Great Society programs, and so the federal government to this day would probably be a lot larger than it currently is, and the scope of it, etc., would be a lot like larger than it is today. And then finally, President number 15, President Bill Clinton. Now, Bill Clinton became president in 1992 for our own timeline. However, within this, if Richard Nixon dies in 1994, he would have become the president in 1994. And Bill Clinton is still alive at the time of recording this. So Bill Clinton, for virtually all of my life, because I was born in late 1993, he would be president. So he'd be the president, even, you know, at the time of writing this in 2021, he would still be the president. So that's 27 years of one man in office. So, you know, some people like Bill Clinton, some people don't like Bill Clinton, but imagine all of the kind of tumultuous time over the last like 30 years if you'd had the same president in office, right? Certainly a lot of the Republicans would be very, very annoyed. They tried to impeach Clinton in our own timeline. They were very hostile to Obama. They're very hostile to Biden and to Hillary Clinton, etc., etc. You know, I think that a lot of people within the Republican Party and within the conservative movement in general would be fuming under this current system. Yeah, and like even if it wasn't them, say if it would end up being George Bush Senior, yeah, like kind of, or George Bush Jr. or whoever, right? Any president being able to serve from the time that they take office until death, I think this would have been such an unpopular thing. And long story short, hopefully the point of this video is to prove that Alexander Hamilton was wrong, right? If they'd had a president for life, this system here, as it now has transpired over all these hundreds of years, would have been completely chaotic, would have been completely unworkable, probably would have led either to a revolution or a constitutional amendment to change this, because there is no way, you know, I can't even see this thing lasting for 50 years, let alone over 200 years, right? This system is completely unworkable and would just cause far more divisions, far more hostility towards the system than we currently see in our own timeline. You know, because at least in our own timeline, like if you don't like a president, they're gone after 8 years. Here, they're president for life. So you can't even get rid of them. You can't vote them out. You can't impeach them. You can't make them, you know, you can't do anything, right? They can't resign, nothing, right? Until they die, they're the president. So probably more likely than not, I think there probably would have been a lot more assassination attempts, yeah, during like this thing, because the only way for the opposition to ever get rid of someone would be to cause an early election, right? So yeah, I think this system's pretty unworkable. So with that being said, I hope that you enjoyed this video, and you know, if you did, definitely don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe, share with your friends, and watch a whole lot more of our other great videos as well. The next video is going to be on what if the scramble for Africa never happened. So we're going to, you know, leave America for a while and we're going to be focusing on Africa. Yeah, so we're going to be looking at the scramble for Africa, and we're going to be looking at the different competing European interests in that region. And yeah, we're going to be imagining what would have happened if Africa had never been colonized. So yeah, definitely stay tuned for that. And in the meantime, have a great day and bye.